Time now for our Sunday Stand. This is where we hear from someone who thinks that they've seen the light on something while the rest of us are still stumbling about in the dark. This Wednesday is the anniversary of the publication of Charles Darwin's great work on the origin of species. The book changed everything. Some even saw it as a deal-breaker with God. Creationist Phil Robinson has no truck with Darwin. He believes that the key to the universe and everything can be found in a very much older book. Here's his Sunday Stand.
I believe that Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution are wrong. I believe that God created the universe and everything in it. And I also believe that Genesis is a true historical account of the very origin of life. I would describe myself as a young earth creationist. This means that I believe the Bible teaches the earth is less than 10,000 years old. There's no good reason to believe that Genesis is a fancy story or a metaphor. For example, Jesus himself referred to Genesis as a real historical narrative. Creationists are not anti-science, nor are they unscientific. One of the claims used to support the idea of a very old Earth is radioactive dating methods. But this process is flawed. For example, we have dated material which we know the age of, and this process has failed to be accurate. So why would you trust it on materials which you don't know the age of? One of the principles of evolution is that humans have evolved from a single cell to the complex, intelligent beings that we are today through a process of natural selection. But natural selection actually takes away from the argument of evolution. I mean, think about it. You can only select from what you already have. The question is, where does the new information come from? Having looked at the evidence, I firmly believe that Genesis is right. God is the author of life. He didn't use evolution, nor did he set it in motion. God lovingly designed and created the whole universe.
And Phil Robinson joins us now. What do you think of his view? Could evolution be wrong? If you have a webcam, go to our website now, click on the video call link. You can make your point by phone, by text, by email, or by tweet. And the details all on the screen now. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk to Anne first. Partly because you wanted to make the final point on the previous debate, but partly because, as a Christian, you've read the Bible. Is the story of Genesis literally true?
I believe, I'll put my cards on the table, I believe the Bible to be inspired by God and true from cover to cover, and all we need for salvation, and the most important book that has ever been written. So I absolutely believe the Bible, and I absolutely believe the Genesis account.
Do you believe that the world was created in 6 days?
No, because I don't think that's what Genesis is saying. You see, I'm not a scientist. Every scientist whom I know and respect tells me that the evidence for evolution is absolutely overwhelming. I include in that, for instance...
With all due respect, you are an author, aren't you? So you understand the context of grammar?
Exactly. That's what I'm going to come on to in a minute, Phil. I mean, just let me finish that sentence. I include in that my brother, who's a professor of nanomaterials at Oxford University, who taught me to read my Bible and taught me how important it is.
So he is a Christian as well?
So he is a Christian, and I know a lot of Christian scientists who see absolutely no contradiction whatsoever between the account in Genesis and what Darwin has brought to us, nor do I. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I have to believe on things like global warming and so on. I believe scientists because I'm not equipped to, you know, to examine that. But I am trained to read literature. As you say, I'm a writer. I read English at university, and I'm trained to read what kind of literature this is. And it's not, the problem I have with creationism is not the scientific problem, which is not my area of expertise. The problem I have with creationism is it seems to me such a distortion of the text and what the text is telling us that it is completely, you know, it violates the biblical text. It's not that kind of an account. It's not an account to tell us that the details of how God created the world. I'll give you an example that proves that. I mean, there are many examples of this, but the beginning of the second chapter of Genesis tells us a different account, which in some ways appears to contradict. It says that there was no vegetation before there was man, because there were no men and women to till the earth. The previous chapter, you know, a few verses earlier, has described the vegetation as coming before the men. men. There's a totally different account of how men and women were created. Now, do we think the writer of Genesis was completely bonkers? No, this was somebody who put these two texts together, expecting us to read them intelligently and understand that he's telling us something completely different, or not completely different, but much more important. God made the world. The world was made good. It's created by God. Mankind, men and women, are put here to care for the world. It's gone wrong in all sorts of profound ways. Phil, this is what Genesis is telling us.
You're taking it too literally.
No, what we do is we compare the different genres within the Bible, and we can see which is historical, which is parable, which is prophecy. It's not very hard to do, and whenever we look at the Hebrew, especially of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we can see there's lots of things. There's no parallelisms, which would be used in poetry or prose in the Bible, and certainly there's no...
But there are echoes. Every single day ends the same. And there were days before there was even a sun and a moon, so
that's correct, but if you also go to number 7 in Bible as well, number 7 also gives that same formula of the days, 7 days, and yet we read it as a historical narrative.
But Phil, where do you... why have you decided that Genesis is literal?
Well, I don't... To say it's literal is incorrect. We read it in its own grammatical context, which is historical narrative, which some people would call literal. So we read it as it's intended, both by the author and both by God as well. And if you look at the New Testament as well, you see Jesus refers to Genesis as historical narrative.
How do you get that from the way Jesus refers to Genesis?
Well, if you look at it whenever he's asked about divorce, for an example, he refers to the first man and woman, and he goes back to Genesis 2.
Yes, but he doesn't say,
let me finish
not
that.
as historic, he's drawing his doctrine.
He quotes from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 at the same time.
Right.
He runs them both together. He sees no contradiction in it.
Neither do I.
If you read both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 properly, as I don't believe that you do, you'll see that Genesis 2 is a further explanation of what goes on in Genesis 1.
Okay, and I just want to go...
With due respect, that does not prove that Jesus sees them as historical in the way that I believe you're trying to say they are. Of course Jesus sees the accounts as true.
He also refers to the flood as historical. He refers to Cain and Abel as historical.
But I just want to interrupt, and the reason I want to interrupt is because, Anne, as you said, there are scientists who can argue about this as well, and one of them, Professor Andy McIntosh, is a professor of thermodynamics. Does science support Darwin, Professor?
Very definitely. I've got in my hand here a feather, and if you look at a feather at the micro level, you'll see a marvellous mechanism of hooks and ridges which keep the barbs together. That's just one example out of millions of examples that we can show that it isn't just the material and energy that's got to come into existence. You've got to get arrangement, and arrangement doesn't come without a mind.
Okay, hang on. So, sorry, can I just stop you for a moment, Professor?
Yeah,
my question was, does science support Darwin?
No, it doesn't support Darwin. It supports design, and it supports very strongly the statements which obviously are in the Bible as well. But the science strongly supports that there is design in every living creature.
And when you say design, you mean a designer. You mean God as the designer.
Absolutely. I'm a Bible-believing Christian, and I support what Phil's been saying recently. But if you just come from the science actually leads you incontrovertibly to seeing that there must be a design, there must be a mind behind such things as the feather that I've just shown you. You could go to molecular machines like the ATP motor. Again, they clearly show that this must have had a mind behind it.
But, Professor, can I just ask you, when you say must, there must have been a mind behind it, do you say because it couldn't have been created in any other way, therefore there is a gap in our understanding, therefore there must be a creator?
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
Many people try and accuse us of a God of the gaps idea. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in the very things that we know, that is, the things like the feather that I mentioned, the things like the ATP motor, which produces energy in every living cell, every single facet of that which we know strongly indicates that you've got machinery here which indicates that a mind is behind it. It's not the things we don't know, it's the very things we do know. The DNA carries digital information effectively on every single strand of the DNA. There is coded information. Coded information implies that there must have been a programmer to actually put it there.
Okay, I want to talk to Dr. Jeremy Pritchard. Dr. Pritchard, you're a bioscientist at the University of Birmingham. We have just heard from a respectable scientist, a professor of thermodynamics, arguing there is a designer. When you hear that argument, what is your response? Right, that's clearly not your response. Unfortunately, the technology has let us down.
If I could comment on this point, the idea of God as the watchmaker, that often is put forward that, you know, but if you look at a watch, it's something so incredibly complicated that must have had a designer, and the universe is so much more complicated, so much had a designer. A watch is an inanimate object. It's incapable of organic change. But human beings, animals, we are living organisms. We are capable of change at a micro level and a larger level. There was a recent programme with David Attenborough where he looked at the development of the eye. We're often told by creationists the eye is this perfect thing that does all it has to do perfectly. But Attenborough actually demonstrated every single stage of evolution of the eye, from the most basic thing that could tell the difference between light and dark.
That is nonsense. What Attenborough didn't demonstrate is how that light is transmitted to the brain and how that light image...
I'll just not bother then,
No, Val, finish your point and then...
he demonstrated every stage of evolution between just the difference between light and dark to this incredibly...
Hang on, Phil, please, can you just let Val make the point, and then you can make your point.
Oh, well, fancy pictures on a TV screen, I'm going to believe that over you.
Phil,
I'm sorry, what you're talking about is an issue of faith. What I'm talking about is something that's demonstrable. What about fossils? What about what about dinosaurs? What about fossils that we can age as millions of years old? What about those?
Let's let Phil answer that.
Dinosaurs are fantastic. There's one called Dr. Mary Schweitzer who in 2009-2005 published information in Science magazine to show that we have actually found dinosaur tissue within the past couple of years in a hadrosaur and a T-Rex. In the hadrosaur we found different proteins. Now, could you explain to me how dinosaur bone, which was dated 80 million years old, had proteins still in it?
Okay, can I want to talk to Dr. Pritchard. I want to talk to Dr. Jeremy Pritchard because he is a bioscientist and I want him to put his point across. Dr. Pritchard, you have heard the arguments from the creationists. What is the scientific community's response?
Well, I mean, it's a standard response. Here we have the old doctrine of natural theology: studying the world will get you closer to God. This is what Newton did. This is what scientists through the years did, until David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, blew this out of the water in 1776. And out of these ideas of studying the world and seeing complexity, we get these outmoded ideas of design. There is an appearance of design, but in fact things are not designed. They look like they're designed, but they're not actually. All the examples that you've heard about today and others, such as the bombardier beetle and various other things that are put forward, we can easily explain how they evolved by evolution. And the premise that we get from Dr. Robinson that we have this perfect creation from in the Bible is rubbish. I mean, if you've got varicose veins or piles or heart disease, these are all consequences of imperfect creation.
On that biological thought, we have to end it. Dr. Pritchard, I'm very sorry, we do have to bring the debate to an end there, but thank you very much indeed.